It's common in Britain today to hear people talk about different classes. Are you working class, middle class, upper class?
Upper middle class, lower middle class, middle class, respectable working class.
Thanks, Schrödinger.
Established middle class, technical middle class, traditional working class.
We get the point.
There's no thoroughness anymore.
Identifying with a particular class today isn't necessarily about what job you have, your smartphone, or how other people label you. Many of us base our class identification on our family background. For most of us, it's just something we feel. 60% of British adults identify themselves as working class, which means that the term working class resonates with people from a huge range of different backgrounds, occupations, income levels, and living standards. But as much as people might identify as working class today based on feelings and associations, the idea of the working class itself is rooted in something far more definitive and urgent. It was only by identifying themselves as part of the working class that a major portion of the British population succeeded in their struggle for representation and rights. Without this identification, these people could never have united or succeeded. In the feudal systems of medieval Europe, there were broadly three fixed social categories of person. You could be an aristocrat, a church official, or everyone else. Most ordinary people living and working in rural areas would see themselves first as members of families or villages, or as labourers working for a particular landowner. The landowner was basically a personal ruler. He controlled all the voting in your area, owned your house and the land you worked on, and chose the priest for your community. Travel beyond the local area was extremely rare, and labourers identified only with the area they lived in. If you only see 100 to 200 other people for most of your life, then it's hard to engender a sense of belonging to a larger group. Agriculture was tough work. It demanded a 7-day working week with subsistence wages, and if your crops failed, your family went hungry. But by the end of the 18th century, things were getting worse for labourers. The centralisation of farms into larger estates meant that far fewer workers were needed, and new technology, like the threshing machine, invented around 1786, was putting labourers out of a job. This led to a huge surplus population of workers in the countryside, and rampant unemployment and poverty. Cities, on the other hand, were creating new jobs. Inventions like Cartwright's power loom boosted industries like textiles, as Britain became the workshop of the world. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and cities represented opportunity. In the early decades of the 19th century, people flocked from the countryside to live in poverty-ridden cities. But as well as squalor and disease, they met with new people, products, and new ideas. In the countryside, you might have been part of a small group of workers employed by a landowning family. But in the city, you were one of tens of thousands of workers, most of whom you'd never met, but who shared your circumstances and your economic and political interests too. Workers in cities realised for the first time how greatly they outnumbered other groups. In addition to this developing awareness of their numbers and shared experience, workers came into contact with books, newspapers, and radical ideas, and they could gather more easily than ever before to exchange those ideas. As workers started to realise their collective potential, they began meeting and planning how to put their ideas for a fairer society into practice. Initially, it wasn't obvious that the average working person's political and economic interests might differ from middle-class industrialists, shopkeepers, and property owners. Many workers had joined forces with small traders and industrial owners to campaign for fairer political representation for the cities in the early years of the 19th century. These reformers all saw a benefit to rebalancing power away from aristocrats who'd inherited their land, titles, and voting privileges. The first Reform Act was eventually passed by Parliament in 1832. It expanded the vote to small landowners and shopkeepers, but left out the vast majority of working people. Urban workers realised that if they wanted rights for themselves, they'd be better off following their own political agenda, distinct from the middle class. And they put this distinction into practice when Richard Cobden and John Bright founded the Anti-Corn Law League in 1836. The Corn Laws made the importation of grain from abroad prohibitively expensive, even when food was short in Britain. This benefited landowners who could receive higher prices for their own grain, but hurt everyone else. The removal of tariffs would benefit British manufacturers by opening new markets for their exports, and repeal would reduce food prices for all. So the interests of the middle class and workers were, in theory, aligned. But urban workers who'd been left out of the political system by the Reform Act of 1832 argued that if they had the vote, problems such as the Corn Laws wouldn't arise in the first place. They were supported, ironically, by a charismatic Irish landowner, Feargus O'Connor. O'Connor was an inspiring speaker who advocated for radical issues such as poverty relief and universal manhood suffrage. He was the proprietor of the Northern Star newspaper and criticised the middle-class Anti-Corn Law League. The emerging working class refused to support the Anti-Corn Law League. They set out to pursue their own political agenda. In 1836, a cabinet maker named William Lovett formed the London Working Men's Association. In 1838, the association produced the People's Charter, which crystallised an agenda for political reform and was endorsed by Feargus O'Connor's Northern Star newspaper. The charter demanded 6 democratic reforms. The right to vote for all men over the age of 21. This was in the context of only about 4% of the population being able to vote at the time. Voting by secret ballot, so that voters couldn't be intimidated to vote a particular way by employers or landlords. No property qualification for members of parliament, so that anyone could be elected regardless of wealth. Salaries for members of parliament, again so that politics wasn't the preserve of the rich. Equal sized constituencies, so that industrial areas with more working people would be represented on equal terms with rural areas. Annual elections to hold representatives to account. The working people in the cities who supported the People's Charter, known as Chartists, had a political dream, a dream which became a core part of their identity. The Chartists presented petitions with millions of signatures to Parliament in 1838 and 1842, hoping to win through sheer force of numbers. These huge petitions, which had excited a whole section of society, contained a long list of grievances: inequality, heavy-handed policing, and high taxes. The Chartist solution was that all working men should be given the vote, and for women, the enfranchisement of their husbands and brothers was at least a step in the right direction. Giving workers a direct voice was seen as a dangerous threat to the fabric of the country, and Parliament's response to their demand was withering. Lord John Russell declared, "In the present state of popular education, I will not say whether a standard of education sufficiently high can ever be obtained among the labouring classes, but in the present condition of the people at large, there would be members returned to this House whose votes would be favourable to the destruction of our institutions and would shake the security of property." This rhetoric was completely different to that which politicians had aimed at the campaigners of the middle-class Anti-Corn Law League. Anti-Corn Law meetings weren't broken up by the police, but Chartist meetings were. This double standard helped reinforce the split between ideas of an unruly urban working class and a respectable middle class. Feargus O'Connor's Northern Star made sure that politicians' attitudes towards the labouring classes was read far and wide. The same class to be a slave class still, the mark and brand of inferiority are not to be removed, the assumption of inferiority is still to be maintained, the people are not to be free.
The Chartists had a song, didn't they?
They did, yes.
We should sing it.
We don't need to
Tremble, ye tyrants, tremble as you hear the thrilling accents of the glorious cheer. For no, these peals are not of drunken glee, but those of men determined to be free.
When their petitions were ignored, Chartists led by John Frost tried a violent uprising in Newport, South Wales in 1839 and a general strike across the north of England in 1842. Neither worked. The authorities arrested thousands of strikers, and both John Frost and Feargus O'Connor were jailed. After the failure of the Newport Rising, it became clear that the vast majority of working people didn't want to pursue a violent revolutionary strategy. But as well as signing petitions and attending protests, Chartists wrote poetry and put on plays, inspired by Shakespeare and historic events like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Drama was a way of debating pressing issues like the potential and limits of political violence, and raising funds for imprisoned Chartists. The culture you consumed now associated you with a particular politics and a class identity. The Chartist meetings and events, whether in the alehouse or the theatre, brought the urban working class together behind a common cause. Chartism was nurturing a class consciousness among urban workers. At the same time, the government, MPs and those in positions of influence were also, thanks to Chartism, beginning to see the working classes as a distinct movement. A movement with its own interests and specific demands, distinct from middle-class industrialists and tradespeople. Chartist leader Feargus O'Connor was elected as a Member of Parliament for Nottingham in 1847. In the same year, the Factory Act limited the length of the working day to 10 hours for women and children. Although technically this didn't apply to men, because of the nature of factory shift work, most people's working week was limited. For the first time, here was a law which directly advanced the interests of Britain's urban workers, and not as a byproduct of campaigning from the middle classes. It showed that even without the vote, the working classes had some influence in how the country was run. Chartism's final push was in 1848, when O'Connor organised for thousands of Chartists to gather on Kennington Common before presenting a third major petition demanding democratic reform. The authorities prevented the planned march on the House of Commons by recruiting 150,000 special constables from the middle classes, placing a kind of class barricade between them and urban workers. In the face of the government's tough stance against petitions, meetings and protests, Chartism seemed to be failing, and O'Connor sank into a depression and alcoholism. However, he and the Chartists had made belief in democracy synonymous with the working class in 19th century Britain, and even though O'Connor himself didn't live to see it, most of the movement's goals were eventually achieved. Chartism had set Britain on the path to democracy by giving a voice to the shared values of a rising working class. Working class identity would now keep the idea of democracy alive. If you enjoyed this video about the Chartists and the working class, then you might enjoy this video over here about the earlier campaigns for democracy in Britain.